Welcome to the Biltmore Church podcast. This is episode 4. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a tool that will hopefully help you do just that. My name is Christian Cooper. I serve on staff here at the church. And I'm here today with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank, and Tyler Flores, who serves on our communications and production team. Glad you guys have jumped on today. As you all probably know who are listening and watching this, we're in the middle of a 6-week teaching series about the gospel and emotional health called Can We Talk About It? And so today, our episode, we're actually going to be taking a lot of some of the questions you've submitted over the last few weeks and trying to tackle some of those things together. So it'll be a little bit of a Q&A format for today's episode. But before we dive into that discussion, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't first take a look back on Sunday and talk about what God did briefly at our church. Obviously, we talked a lot about contentment, covetousness, which is such a difficult word to say. Covetousness, contentment, envy, all these things wrapped up. And really, I think what I'd love to start by talking about is that second half of the message, which is application being generosity and gratitude. I did my homework, and I made my generosity list last night. There's only 29 items, so it didn't take me that long.
Your gratitude list or your generosity? 29 on generosity. Well done.
That
would
be
well done.
Didn't even realize I said that.
You are now broke.
Gratitude list.
Just the
gratitude list of 29. I'll make my generosity list next week.
There you go.
But yeah, I wanted to just kind of talk through, as you were studying the text, some of those two big things as application points, where those ideas came from, or some of the thoughts you had in sermon prep this last week.
Right. Well, covetousness is something we've all had to deal with, whether you call it envy, discontentment, whatever. And so when you looked at the text, especially the Luke text, generosity was the thing that was going to break it. But then the whole word of covetousness is like, I got to have more, I got to have more, I got to have more. It is so easy to have that, as we talk about. It's so easy to feel entitled, like I deserve this. And when you get in there, it's just a difficult. It's a malaise that sort of goes over your life, because it's always, I got to have this next thing, whether it be a promotion, a raise, a house, or whatever, and it's the carrot on the stick. And so, the application to get away from that is gratitude. Look what God has done. Now, that's not to get away from ambition and so forth and so on. I think we tried to explain that, but I mean, I've looked at covetousness in the mirror plenty of times to realize, all right, you have to be proactive. And that's where it kind of came with that when he says, be on your guard. You can't just let these, you'll be going down the river. You'll get in the stream, because we swim in the stream of covetousness. As I said yesterday, billions of dollars a year are spent to convince us that we are entitled to more.
Yep.
And so that's where
it doesn't
came
even
from.
take billions of dollars. It takes about $5 sometimes.
No, but it taps into the human nature and the flesh and the insecurity and all of those things, and they're good at what they do.
I think what's wild about the covetousness specifically, and just that desire for more, I'm 35 years old, and I've been married for about 10 years. And I remember when my wife and I first got married, I was working at Chick-fil-A. She was working at Bed Bath & Beyond, and we had student loans to pay back. And so, needless to say, we were running really close to the line, if not a little bit behind the line most of the time. And I just remember thinking, I had this beat-up car. I was doing all my own repairs. I was just like, if I could just get a car with AC that worked, I would just be so happy with my life. That would be the thing. I would know that I've arrived. I had two specific goals for myself financially. One, a car with AC. And two, I wanted to be able to go out to eat and not look at the check and not be like, let me do the math on that. Are we going to be okay? I want to be not even look at, just sign my name at the bottom.
Tell me when you get to that state, because I look at it still. So.
No, for sure. But what's wild to me is that in this 10-year journey, I have a job that pays my bills. We're able to put money away. I have a car with functioning AC. And the number of times I've caught myself now if I could just get, my brother-in-law, he's got a Tesla, and I just love driving that thing. And the number of conversations I've had with my wife, now if we just got a Tesla, I would be, and you have to check, oh my gosh, not 10 years ago, which really isn't that long in the grand scheme. I was I just need a car with AC. And now I'm nah, I need people to hit 120 miles an hour in 5 seconds in order to find happiness. And it's a lie. It's wild how fast you can just, what you said about being in a current, you're just, if you don't think about it, it's going to take you right there.
Right.
The thing I wrote down in my notes yesterday. I've heard a few weeks ago you said something like, some of the most dangerous words you can say is "I got this." I don't even remember what week that was, but yesterday it seemed like same idea. The most dangerous words you can say is "I deserve this." I deserve this. And anytime I catch myself thinking that, or even saying that to somebody else, or just in my own psyche, that is a dangerous road to be on. And so battling that with simple things of gratitude. And my list had some funny ones on there. I mean, yours had brisket. Mine had pasta. I love Italian food, so I put pasta on my gratitude list. But that continuum between what you're entitled to versus what you're grateful for, and trying to find, obviously you want to be leaning toward gratitude all the time. But just to wrap it up, I think the big thing about Luke chapter 12, that verse that stood out, which is, hey, be on your guard. But then the next part of that says, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And I really know, I feel like we're beating a dead horse here, but I think it's worth saying this is about your identity. Your life does not, he's saying you're not identified by the sum of your possessions. And so just like it seems like every other week in the series, it comes back to identity every single week. But again, powerful Sunday. And I'd encourage you guys, if you were here yesterday, look back on those notes. Make sure you do the homework. We might do a little pop quiz for if you did your gratitude list. But make sure you go back and check out last week's message on gratitude, contentment, covetousness. I'm getting better each time I say it.
Conquering covetousness.
When I was writing down my notes yesterday, I literally stared at it because I was sure I'd spelled it wrong. Like I wrote covetousness down, and I was just like, that doesn't look right. I think I got it though. I think I'm good.
There's a U in there somewhere. That's all I know.
Yeah. Did I spell it right? Is that right?
As far as you know, yes, it is.
Okay,
as far as you know,
fantastic.
I just put down envy.
You did not know that you were going to be asked on the podcast today to spell that word properly, right. But here we are. Here we are. Awesome. Hey, we're going to get into some of your questions you've been submitting over the last few weeks, and I want to say thank you to everybody who took the time to email us and submit questions, or just grab me in the lobby and ask me a question or throw an idea out there. Had some folks even from my Connect group send a couple in. So before we dive in, I just want to clarify what we're going to do today is, some of these questions were so personal, and, it was like some people were like, hey, you can use my name. Other people were like, hey, please don't use my name. I'm just not going to use anybody's name here. And I'm just going to ask the questions as if I'm asking them. But know that a lot of these were straight out of the hearts of our people. And I think some of these are going to be, I'm really curious to see some of the answers. I was trying to get ahead a little bit and look through these, and I was like, I don't know how I would answer this. So should be fun today. So here we go. First question for Pastor Bruce here, or for Tyler, jump in whenever you want. Loving the series so far, why do you think the church has been so hesitant to talk about mental health? And why do you choose now to examine this subject?
Well, I mean, on the first one, I can't speak for every church, but in general, we made the blanket statement that the emotions don't need to rule us. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that they're not a gift from God, but we've talked about they can't be the ruler, and that's where went back to Crawford Loritz's deal about the will and about the mind. And so I think churches have said, all right, the truth, and almost said, okay, here's the truth, and regardless of how you ever feel about it, but you have to just dealing with feelings, that is a gift from God. We just don't want our feelings to rule us. So I think in general, probably the churches in some degree just said, we're not even going to, it's like a lot of subjects, we're not even going to touch it. And that really kind of disconnects you because everybody deals with it. And I think for us in particular, coming out of the last 2+ years, I don't think anybody went through that unscathed. And so almost everybody went through a wide range of emotions. And I've said it 100 times before that if you went into the pandemic unhealthy, you really potentially went off the cliff. If you went into it relatively healthy, you really struggled. If you went into it healthy, you still struggled. And so nobody went through, because there was just so much dynamic going on, the uncertainty, the financial stuff, all the vitriol on Twitter and elections and you name it, and it was there, and plus, and then people got more and more unhealthy, and then what happens is then they take it out on other folks, and it gets. And it's by far. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years, pastoring, and by far the last 2 years have been the craziest and most difficult leadership challenge. And if you're a leader, you just put it up about another 10 notches because that's. But I mean, that's part of your job. You're supposed to, if you're a leader, then that means you've got people following you, which means that they're going to look to you for some answers. And you're at the same time, you're trying to keep your own stuff together because you're struggling. I've shared a couple of times, throwing the golf club in the tree and different things like that. Everybody had their point. And if you didn't have some systems, then it really got to probably be a really dark place. And we could see that in our people. No matter how large your church is, there's enough of a sample that you can see, all right, marriages are falling apart, depression is skyrocketing, you can read the studies, all that stuff. So just observing just culture and your church said this is the right time to do it.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of times when a topic sort of becomes like a cultural idol in God itself, that's generally a little bit of a sign, hey, this is something that we need to talk about as a church. And
Right.
what I'm hearing you say there is, for a lot of people, especially over the last few years, that idea of emotions ruling them, that's their God, then we need to talk about that.
Well, and I think Kevin mentioned it great last week. The cousin of that is the fact that just because you feel something does not even make that. It's not that the feeling is not real; it just doesn't make it accurate. And today, in our culture, taking COVID out of the way, if you feel something, then that's the authentic you, and that is the God of our age right now. It's like this is my authentic self just because I feel that way. Well, you don't want to tell a 10-year-old that or anybody that, and that's why we said the Bible says the heart's deceitfully wicked, who can know it? That's why Jesus said out of the heart come all sorts of evil thoughts, and so those need to be governed. And again, with the conviction that, God did make the emotions at the same time. He loves us. And when he says this is going to hurt you, we need to understand that. And just because we feel that way doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And it's going to lead to more sorrow and more hurt.
Absolutely. That's great stuff. So I want to skip down to one of the later questions. I think that question set up this one as well. So let me make sure I can find this right one. This will be a fun one. Says, I'd love to know how you all, parentheses, the hosts of the podcast, how your emotional health has been throughout the past couple of years. What were some of the things that you found helpful to get you through this season? Now, we got 2 Enneagram 8s on here, and this is the last thing we want to do is open up, but we're going to do it together.
What are you on the Enneagram?
I'm a 4, actually.
Okay, well, you feel much better than Christian and I do then.
Okay.
My wife's a 4.
How about this? Since you love doing this kind of thing, so I'm going to let you jump in first, Tyler.
Okay.
And then we'll jump after you.
The things that we feel are it's impossible to divorce them from our circumstances, right? And that's why we can't rely on them, right? Because we can't let our circumstances be our God the same way that we can't let our feelings be our God. So circumstantially for me, the pandemic was tied up in a shift. I moved states, I moved jobs. So there was a lot of upheaval. And so it was odd for me because on one hand, there was the excitement of starting a new job. So it was some people who had been like living in this dark place. I had this like light of like, man, I'm going to do something new. And there was a general sense of excitement to that. But I think underneath it all, I think the thing I struggled with the most was this general sense of unease. I don't know what's going to happen next. And that was tied to both a new job, a new place, but also the world just didn't look the way that it was supposed to look.
Right.
I would look out the window, not actually out the window, but out through my computer screen at the world and just feel like, and honestly, that hasn't stopped. By the way, like the pandemic is done, but the world is still a pretty wild place, and not what I think. If you had asked me to like, Tyler, predict major world events in the next 5 years, I would not have picked any of the things.
Right.
And so I think for me, my anxieties are often tied up in things that I can't control.
Right.
And so I remember Kyla, my wife, I was like, inflation is real bad. There's a recession coming. We got to do something. And she just looked at me like, what are we going to do, Tyler? Like, are you just going to, like, what are you going to put money under the mattress?
Stop driving that car with air conditioning.
Right, exactly.
Is what you need to do.
So that's, my anxieties are always tied up in things I can't control. And I think for me, if I had to put a finger on a thing, it would be the amount of things that I have not had control over has caused me deep levels of anxiety that I've had to give over to the Lord, and I'm not successfully all the time.
That's great example. I would say one of the things that I just think over the last 3 years that have kind of exposed it in me, I'm a type of person, I love being in high gear all the time. I don't like to stop or slow down. I'm like, let's just keep going for the glory of God. And I can put this mask of spirituality over it, but that's my natural setting and bent. And so COVID hits, and like for many people, everything stops and slows down. And I'm like, oh, I have like literal withdrawals right now because I'm constantly running full speed. What does that say about my inability to actually like truly rest? And so that was something. Now, granted, we worked really hard over the course of COVID, but it was different. You know, you were like you said earlier, Tyler. You were at home. It was a slower pace, I guess is the right word, and it was just a different, way of thinking, way of doing ministry, way of working. And so that kind of kept coming back up in my own life. Is like, why can't I just rest? Why can't I slow down without feeling so uneasy and so anxious? And so, and then add to that circumstances. I was asking a question that to answer the second part of the thing, which is, hey, what did you find that was helpful? I started asking myself the question a lot, what is God trying to teach me right now? Like as of today, let's not ignore the circumstances that are in front of you or complain about them, but let's start with like, what could he be trying to teach you and guide you through during this season? And that's become something that I've just kind of held on to. Like, I'll probably hold on to that for the rest of my life because it's been so helpful for me. But again, not a perfect thing. I'm not saying I didn't complain ever or I didn't, kind of go off the deep end a couple times. But there is that idea of a change of perspective that was forced that's helped me ask different questions about my own life. So that's about as open as I can be.
I remember the day, I remember coming up here and nobody was here except me and a couple of the senior guys and Ranger. And it's like, wow, this is, and I remember being the week before being, on a hog hunt and walking through Atlanta airport and, you had, tiny little disturbance, but not even that. And then 3 days later, it's just, it's where did everybody go? And obviously there was a kind of a sense of sadness over the country and the world. And just because the uncertainty and then you're once you get isolated, which everybody kind of isolated a little bit, it just, so, you ran the gamut. But I would say this, the principles are still the same on how do you get through difficult times. Your faith, your friends, and then God's going to take you on that journey and going back. It's not that it's always going to be super happy, but looking back, it's easier to go, okay, this is what God was doing. But even yesterday, I think I can't remember if I said it in the second service or whatever. I remember taking a run, maybe a few weeks into COVID, and everything was still super shut down. And we praise Him, or what was our number one song? What was our first song yesterday?
Yeah,
praise Him.
Praise Him.
And it's like, this is what heaven sounds like. There's that one phrase in there. And I remember I was running back kind of by Mills River, and I was like, man, I look forward to the day when that actually, when I hear the sounds of God's people singing that again. And yesterday was kind of yesterday was actually the first time I remember thinking, this is starting to feel like our church again. I mean, I felt like that on little bits and pieces over the last, 6 months as you just see more and more and more folks. But yesterday I was like, okay, I remember the run. It's like, remember when you were running? It's like the Lord was like, remember when you were running and how, sad you were? This is what you kind of looked forward to.
Mm-hmm. It's great stuff. That's
about as much as an 8 on the Enneagram will share.
That's right.
So,
unless it's a
and over
deeply,
here,
that's my transparency. That's the vulnerability.
I could go for another 25
we could do
minutes.
this all day.
All day long.
I'm exhausted now.
I'm tapped out. We're done.
We're done here. Episode finished. Now,
Yes.
here's a fun one. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Pastor. A lot of the focus on the third episode was on how to resolve conflicts within marriages with children and coworkers. What would you suggest to a couple who doesn't argue very much, but who feel very disconnected from each other quite often? The distance between us is more obvious now that we are both retired. Do you have any suggestions on how we can try to improve things?
Yeah, in general, when conflict resolution, go to Matthew 5, Matthew 18, in general. Specifically maritally, though, I would say not to be flippant, but just make plans to connect. You're going to have different times, and we warn people about this all the time. When you first go into an empty nest, if you've built your marriage around the activities of the kids, you're going to have a pause there where you're trying to figure out, because you can get going so fast and be two parallel tracks. And so at this point, if they're both retired, they just have got to spend time reconnecting in something that might come up at a different question. everybody talks about, oh, we had quality time, Quality time comes out of quantity time.
Wow.
You cannot prescribe quality time. You can't sit there and go, okay, sit down, we're going to have 5 minutes quality time. Tell me your deep feelings.
Yeah.
Very rarely does that ever happen. But what happens is when you're in the stream of quality time and you're intentional about it, or of quantity time, the quality time comes out, something is said. There's the moment where your 10-year-old opens up about being bullied at school when all of a sudden it's like, why didn't you could have asked him that and he's not telling you that, but it just comes out. Or you're talking with your spouse and all of a sudden, you're talking about the ball game and the next thing you know, the tears are flowing. But it's very hard to prescribe that. And especially if you've kind of been parallel tracks for a number of years, which maybe that is the case, I would say, listen, the Lord is good. He's giving you some extra time. So just be intentional about reconnecting. Some easy ones. Be honest. I remember when a guy came and did a lot of the Enneagram stuff, and I don't worship at the idol of Enneagram, but to me it's helpful. And when we learned about that, I know Lori and I sat at Boone's Corner for like 3 hours, and she's like, "Usually I have to pull stuff out of you," and I'm just like vomiting all this stuff that I learned that day. And so I would say, sometime Lori will ask me, we've done exercises like, you can get them online. 10 questions. How would you answer these 10 questions?
Yeah.
If you had, whatever, somebody gave you $5,000, what would you immediately do? If you could go anywhere in the world, favorite vacation. So I would just say the key word is intentionality. If you're not connected, make the decision that you're going to do what it takes to connect because it's worth it.
Yeah.
Great stuff. All right, next question. Why do some Christians struggle with depression / mental illness and other Christians don't? It's a fastball.
And let me just say a couple of disclaimers. It is, as I said in the depression message, clinical versus circumstantial. I believe there's both. I know Christians get sideways, and it's like it's all spiritual or it's all physical. And I think what we look there is, God made us both body and soul, and so we can't diagnose if somebody's got, they got thyroid issues that can cause that. You've got a number of chemical things, but taking that out of the side. The circumstantial depression, I think you can trace some different things. And as we looked at, that's where that spiral was very helpful. The first one is you probably get, maybe disappointed, or first of all, you probably get you can be run down and disappointed, and that can all happen at the same time. But then you and I make some choices to exacerbate it, which means it's like I was talking to a lady yesterday after church, and she was talking about she'd just gone through a divorce, and everything in her wanted to isolate. She wasn't here last week, but this was yesterday. She listened to the message, and she's like, I just got divorced. My husband divorced me. Everything wanted to just pull back. And she's like, I had to fight. And fortunately, she was right next to the next steps desk, and was like, hey, here's this person, and we've got actually grief share, divorce care, and blah, blah, blah. And she was doing the right thing, but it goes back to she was doing what she didn't want to do.
Yeah.
Because the big picture was what she wanted. It's like, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And so, I would say, it's, again, there's not one easy answer. There's definitely some patterns that you see about how to go further and further down, just like coming out of it. I get folks speaking truth into my life, because that's what you need when you're really going down into depression. You need people that will lovingly speak truth into your life. Because if not, you start hearing all the lies of the enemy. You're not worth it. You're condemned. God's done with you. Your life is over, blah, 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 blah. And those are just not true, but that's what you hear. And it can spiral. I mean, it gets, like this next week, we're going to be looking at like Numbers 13 and 14, and they're coming back, and they're like, you got part of them are like, man, the giants are so big, and they're this, and they're going to crush us, and we're like grasshoppers. And then you had two people of faith that are like, shut your mouth. That's not true. God's promised this for us. And so, anyway.
No, that's great.
It's Monday, but there's a lot of overflow still.
It's already ready for next Sunday.
Almost.
I think one thing I would throw in there too is, if you're someone who's really struggling with emotional health, and whether that's circumstantial or clinical, so just remember that God can and does use what the enemy means for evil for good.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so the temptation, and for anybody who's experiencing sin or difficulty that's really got a stronghold on their life, is to look at everybody else and go, why is that person not dealing with the same things? Well, they're dealing with stuff too.
Yeah, that's it.
And so God, I'm not saying he gave that to you in every situation, but I am saying he can and does use that for good. And that doesn't make it easy, but that's an important thing to remember. That's one of those truths to hold up so that when the enemy speaks lies into your ear, you've got something bigger and louder kind of speaking in.
The Bible talks about that, like there's one of those verses that I just love that says, when I am weak, he is strong. Like that, the imagery there is not just like, through my journey, it's not just, oh, how awesome is it that like when I'm at my weakest, God is strongest. It's bigger than that. It's that in my weakness, God can be the strongest so that he gets the glory.
Right.
And so that he is the only one at the end of the day that can take any of the credit for anything that's good in me. I can trace it back to God himself. And what you just said about like when I'm struggling and I'm just like, man, why isn't anybody else? I'm alone. No, maybe you do feel alone, and maybe you are a little bit alone in what you're walking through, but God has put it into your hands so that you can give it back to him. Does that make sense? Like in the same way that God has given me, I'm passionate about stories, and so what I do with my job is I tell stories for the glory of God. That's what I do because he put it in my hands. So I want to, but I also have some weaknesses. And he put those in my hands as well. And I want to steward. It's a weird thing to think about, but I want to steward those weaknesses for the glory of God. So at the end of the day, I can point and say, these things in me that are broken or that were broken, God fixed them. And to God be the glory. And let me tell you all about it. That is the thing I think that's brought me the most courage in my darkest moments. Is that I don't struggle with depression, but I have things inside of me that are dark that I wrestle with. Mm-hmm. But I take heart. I take courage knowing that when I'm on the other side, and I'm not there yet, when I'm on the other side, I can only point to Jesus. And that's just more stories that I get to tell of how awesome he is.
Amen to that, man. Amen to that. Awesome. Okay, next question. Is there any scriptural basis for counseling/therapy? And there's a second part I'll ask after we cover the first part. Scriptural basis for counseling.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scriptural basis for counseling is just people speaking into your lives, and so just the book of Proverbs alone, in an abundance of counselors, there's victory. So over and over, it talks about you need some people speaking into your life. To me, a good counselor is somebody who just is whether you call them a trained coach or somebody who speaks truth into your life. And if you're like, what's a good counselor? I think, bottom line, training is awesome, but are they bibliocentric? Are they Christocentric? Are they, because as we said, it's okay to not be okay, but good counseling, in my opinion, is not something that just, I felt better. I have a Band-Aid. It's somebody who is like, listen, the gospel doesn't want to leave you in that state. We're not trying to get by. It might take a long time. I mean, because there's some serious scars and so forth. Mm-hmm. But what they do is they bring you to the gospel and they end up helping you apply that to your life. And again, there's some deep trauma and, the people we use like at Summit Wellness, they're very, very good at that. But so again, the scriptural basis is people speaking in your life, counselors. You call them biblical friends or counselors or whatever it is, but they are people who speak truth into your life.
Yeah, that's great. You actually answered the second part anyway, which is what were you going to look for in a good counselor? And so we don't even have to cover that. You hit both. Well,
and I would say this, if you're listening and you're really struggling, especially with, depression, I would just want to make sure there's some resources on that. Can we talk about it? Whether it be from phone numbers in an emergency, whether it be resources, and all, and your only act that you might need to do is just pick up a phone. Because again, you got to do what you don't want to do to get where you want to get. Because I don't want to be in this hole, but it might just be a simple phone call, or like the lady yesterday, she just took the courage and she's like, listen, I wanted to isolate, but I took a step, and it's like, awesome, man. To God be the glory for that. Now let God's people rally around you, because that's one of the tools God gives you. He gives you God's family.
Great stuff. Next one, I think this ties back to a question we talked about earlier, which is, what are some of the ways you can check in on those you love and start transparent conversations about emotional health? So related to that question about how to connect, but what are some ways to start those conversations?
I mean, I would say, how are you doing? But just realize usually just a quick, how are you doing? I mean, if you ask some people, they'll immediately just, here's everything. If you ask most people, I would say, and I'm not trying to be misogynistic, I would say just having talked to men more than I've talked to women in bigger groups, men are more likely, or I'll just say men are likely to initially not, just to basically say, I'm good. I'm good. And then if you press, they might, I'm good. And then but again, you can't structure. That's why we talk about men have to have a couple of friends, because only over quantity time, it might be around a fire pit. It might be just, and it's just there. Because like for me, I always talk about how your transparency or your authenticity bucket is big.
Right.
You want to be real with everybody, genuine with everybody, but your transparency bucket is very small. And that transparency bucket is based on trust. I mean, like, I'm not going to share something that I think Joe over here is going to be a blabbermouth and go put it on Facebook. Like, forget that. I mean, especially if he's ever done it before, that doesn't come back. All right. But if there's people that have shown little, trust and listen, here's what's going on, man. I'm really, and it could be something deep, or it could be something that's just, again, circumstantial, that just needs some, and a lot of people, like with Lori, I'll verbally process, like just thinking of stuff, and it's just, I'm like, hey, what do you, and I'm not, and she knows now, I'm not looking for an answer, here's her perspective, or have you thought about this? But again, I would say, how do you do it? How you doing? But you got to have relationships to actually have transparent relationships, and that's the first step. I'm
thinking back, one of the things that Jenny said a couple weeks ago, we were talking about parenting, and this was about kids. I think the same principle applies, which is ask vague questions, you're going to get vague answers. Ask specific questions, you'll get more specific answers. And even to your point about men and women and how those relationships work, I think, I don't know if it's Gary Chapman or where this came from, but this idea of you need a combination of both face-to-face time with your loved ones and side-by-side. And men generally, just in general, tend to, those things kind of come more naturally in a side-by-side. So you need to have the conversation around the dinner table where you're looking each other in the eyes, but you also need, maybe you need to go fishing where you're doing something together that's not just you looking at each other talking. And those things will, like you said, I was getting mixed up here, but that quantity is going to start to build up, and then those conversations, sounds like what you're saying, are going to kind of come up a little bit more naturally when those things are
and I would
present.
say one pragmatic skill is to ask a little more open-ended questions. Like the question I just said, how are you doing? That's really not a great question, because I can easily say, fine.
Yeah.
But if I say, hey, like sometime Lori will say, hey, what's one thing I can pray for you about today?
There it is.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I'm like, well, you can pray for, I got a difficult meeting at 10 o'clock. Or I got to do this podcast, and Christian's kind of crazy at 11, and I'm just not sure how it's going to go. Then all of a sudden, number one, it brings her in on the day, but it also shows that it's just a little bit more, it's just peeling back one layer. So just an open-ended question is a little bit more helpful than a yes, no.
That's great. All right, a couple more here before we wrap up today. Pastor Bruce, you talked about some of the steps to take when you're sensing a downward spiral of depression. What are some of the preventative things you can do to protect yourself, to guard yourself from depression before experiencing it? Are they the same steps, or are they different?
I mean, they're the same. I kind of joke with our folks. I'm a terrible counselor. I mean, I tell everybody everything I know in the sermons. So, in the sermons are kind of here's what I've seen in the Bible first, in the mirror second, and in life third.
Yeah.
And so when I'm looking at it, I'm like, here's what happens when we get depressed. You can't avoid the problems. You can't avoid this. You can't, I'm a control freak like a lot of eights are. So it does, when things went out of control, it's like, there's no way you can control that. And that's part of God growing you up as well.
Yeah.
It's like, listen, you can't control this. You can't make something happen, whether it be a prodigal returning home or a pandemic being done or whatever. But what you can do is like, all right, think through it and make sure you don't go down the rabbit hole, which the rabbit hole is like, I'm not picking up that phone. You stop taking care of yourself. You stop getting in the Word. You stop talking to God. And I would say this about talking to God. When you look at people in the Bible, guys like Jeremiah, the one thing they did not do, Moses, all those guys that got, because there's a lot of places where they got, whether you call it clinical depression or circumstantial depression, they got depressed. I mean, they were like, again, Jeremiah 20 is always the one that I go to. Most people don't ever read it because it's, you're never going to see that on a Hallmark card. But he is angry at God, but all those things are true. He's physically depleted because he's been beaten, and he's been prophesying. He also had a hard message. He's been preaching all this thing. Nobody's turning to God. And so what he does do is he doesn't clam up. That's what actually, when you don't talk to God, that is more concerning than if you're like way honest with God. I mean, he says some stuff to God. Most people are like, you can't talk to God that way. And yet Jeremiah was one of the most powerful prophets. I mean, he told God, he's like, God, you seduced me. He actually uses that word. He's like, you tricked me. You seduced me into being a preacher. I mean, he uses a word that was like how somebody would actually go after, like a grown man would go after, some teenager. I mean, that very, very specific term. You tricked me, but God doesn't strike him with lightning. He was being. You look at some of the Psalms. It's like some of the Psalms. He's saying some very honest stuff. My thing is just keep talking to God, even if you have to just vent. God can take it.
Yeah.
God can take it. He's not going to fall off his throne. He's not going to hear anything he hadn't heard before. And then let him bring you back to that thing. But keep talking to God is a huge one.
Yeah, I found that my instincts are almost always wrong on that front. Like my gut instincts, like I'm starting to feel nothing's bad yet, but I'm starting to feel like I'm not sure what's going on. There's been a couple days of like work's been weird or whatever. My instincts are almost always the wrong choice. Like my instinct is just like, oh, let me just think about this. Let me just process on my own. I'm not gonna give it over to my wife or to my accountability partner or God forbid to God himself, because I want to think about it first. I want to process it first, and that's almost always the wrong instinct. And like just to say to God, look, this is everything that I'm feeling. When C.S. Lewis, when his wife passed, and he wrote Grief Observed. Well, he didn't write the book. He just journaled.
Yeah.
Mm.
And
it's like, well, I remember when I picked it up because I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. I think there's a C.S. Lewis quote for just about everything.
Don't use some of them.
Yeah,
Don't use some of them.
But I picked it up thinking it was going to be like help me because I was struggling. But it's like he's just angry. Like the first half of that journal is just like I'm just really upset and God, this whole thing is a joke, man. And it's only through that confession I think that he finds the truth and he lands in a truthful place. But it was a surprise to me because I read it when I was a little bit younger. How honest he was being with God, and it really gave me so I can just say the things that I'm feeling to God, and he's not gonna like get mad at me for feeling these things. The freedom I found in that really was life-changing.
Yeah. One thing that we hadn't even touched on, and I don't really want to touch on it too much, but I hadn't touched on the message either. One of the things when you get into these, sometimes your emotions start to indicate God teaches you where your idols are. Because the stuff you put a lot of security in, a lot of confidence, a lot of identity in, when those get stripped away, and then your emotions go nuts, sometimes he's like, okay, you see, that's where you're getting, that's where you're getting your security, that's where you're getting your identity. And now that that's stripped away, and if you're not careful, you're either going to run to another idol or you're going to run to God. And that's kind of where, just like, even if you got to say some, God's not going to be shocked when you say it. You're already thinking it anyway. So it's not like he's like, I didn't know you were thinking that.
Yeah. He's just waiting on you to bring it to
He's
him.
just waiting on you to get real.
That's great. Last one here, and it's very related to the one we just talked about. Some of the answer may be the same, but what do I do when I feel like I'm far from Jesus because of the things that I'm feeling? I can jump in here first if you guys want. One of the things I was thinking about, I've heard before from multiple different people, and I can't draw the original source off the top of my head, but there's this progression often between thinking about something, feeling something, and then acting on something. So I think sometimes there's this tendency that, well, we've got to feel our way into this choice and this action. And that may not even be the place to start because, again, like we've talked about a lot during the series, sometimes your feelings are going to lie to you. And they're going to tell you things that aren't true, or they're going to lead you in the wrong way. Same thing like we said, following your heart's terrible advice to give people. It's the same idea, but around here we have like so many of these mountain swimming holes that are like these little rivers that kind of pool up, and those things, it doesn't matter if it's the heat of August, those things are freezing cold. And the way I think about it a lot of times is if you're going to go and swim in one of those swimming holes, you're not going to feel your way into wanting to jump off of that rock into the water. Because the more you do, the more you're processing that, the less likely you are to go. Sometimes you've got to just take that faith step or faith jump based on what you know, thinking, what do you know about this thing? Almost bypassing some of those feelings into obedience, I think is huge. So knowing that your feelings may, a lot of times the enemy's going to try to push you away, using your feelings to push you away from him, rather than you understanding that those things are meant to draw you to God.
My daughter is 4, and she feels a lot of things. But something that has been repeated, and it keeps coming up, I don't understand where it's coming from. She's very afraid of lava. And it's just lava makes her very afraid. She's never seen lava outside of like a cartoon, that dealt with, this is a volcano. And she's every time I go somewhere, she says, "Daddy, are there volcanoes there? Are there volcanoes there?" We drove up into Wolf Laurel to visit my family, and she said, "Are there volcanoes here?" I said, "No, there's no volcano. What? We're gonna go see in Tennessee. Are there volcanoes in Tennessee?" She's very concerned. She woke up screaming the other night, and I said, "What's going on? What's going on, sweetheart? Talk to me." And she said, "I just kept thinking about lava." she can't think her way through this. She feels very afraid. And the only thing that she can do is to lean on the truth that I tell her, and that's, sweetheart, there's no lava here. There's no volcano here. You're going to be fine. Her feelings lie to her a lot. And all that I can do as a father is just tell her the truth. And then all she can do as a daughter is to lean on that truth. That's all she's got.
Wow.
And sometimes I can't think my way. I can't just like, okay, what's the, well, I'm going to be all right. Let me just process through. I can only go to God's word and just say, God, I don't know. I'm feeling so many things. I'm surrounded by this lava. But your word is all that I can cling to. And that is always, every single time, enough because it's true.
And I would say, to go with that, when you put the truth, if you say it enough, especially if you know your weak spots. I mean, if there's some lies that you continually buy into, and you can see your pattern. You can see your pattern, man. I buy into this lie. And this is where I go. It is smart. If you look at Ephesians 6, it talks about actually what is the offensive weapon. He actually uses a word that's not just the general Bible. It's actually a word from the Bible. All right, and he's like, it's very good to have at least something that you can say. All right, this is the way I'm feeling, but here's the truth from God's word. An obvious example, you feel condemned, you feel like God can't use you because you failed again or whatever, you feel like God's put you on the shelf, Romans 8:1.
Yep.
And so you feel condemned, but if you're in Christ, you are not condemned because Jesus was condemned for you. But the feeling, you feel condemned. I mean, everybody's felt ashamed, all those things. And so again, truth, go back to the deal, the two banks of the river, and one of the biggest bank there is truth. And after a while, I found if I can speak truth to that feeling, at some point the feelings begin to change. At some point. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen over time.
Yeah.
Great stuff today. Thank you guys so much for jumping in and answering some easy, some difficult questions. We're going to hopefully cover some more of these as we go. So I want to thank you for submitting some of those. And also I want to encourage you to keep doing that. Keep emailing us. We've got that email set up. You can send your questions to podcast@biltmorechurch.com. We're going to discuss those each and every week. Some of them fall perfectly into some of the topics we're going to talk about. Next week's episode, you're not going to want to miss that. We've got another special guest coming on as well, so I want to encourage you to check that out next Wednesday. And then also, again, we mentioned this earlier when we were talking about some of these questions, but we've got a website set up with all types of resources that you can take advantage of, and that's at canwetalkaboutit.com. So make sure you go and check those out. It's been cool to hear already some of the ways that people have been benefiting from those resources. So hopefully this was an encouragement to you today. I hope you've been challenged in your walk with Jesus. Hope you've been strengthened as you follow him. I know it's been a faith builder for me, and I hope it has been for you as well. And again, you guys know what we do. Pastor, you did it last week. Tyler.
You are loved. You are sent.
There we go. You're loved and sent. Bye.